Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session. And today I'm going to be talking about mastering Power BI design with user-centric frameworks and a little bit about me. So if you haven't heard of me before, my name is Kerry Kolosko and I am head of data visualization at Insight Factory in Adelaide, South Australia, and we have offices all through Europe as well. So we're a new company with interesting things in the pipeline. I'm also an avid blogger, so I blog a fair bit on data visualization techniques with Power BI. And with that, I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional for some of my community activities, such as Workout Wednesday, and that's a weekly challenge where we set as a team a number of Power BI challenges where people can learn and flex their data visualization muscles. So if you haven't heard of that, get on that. It's a fun activity to do. And I'm also available on LinkedIn if you'd like to follow me and learn more about myself and what I do and the data visualizations that I share. So moving forward, what is this session about? So when I first started this, I had this big grand idea that I would talk about sort of getting to ways to understand our customers' needs more broadly. However, I needed to cut that down because my deck was getting far, far too big. So what we're going to be talking about today is some of the things that I hear about in the community a lot. Things like, I'll spend months building a dashboard, then no one uses it. Or I'll spend months building a dashboard and then they ask, can I export that to Excel? Which is probably one of the most demoralizing things a Power BI developer can hear, that their reports aren't being adopted. And there's a number of reasons why that our reports aren't being adopted. Sometimes our reports do have a shelf life. So if we've built a dashboard for COVID monitoring or something like that, we know that that's only going to be around for a few months or so. Anything to do with strategic initiatives, they have a shelf life. And any other sort of KPIs will do that. But other reasons for that is in part for not understanding our customer needs and needing to spend a little bit more time upfront in our design process, making sure that we're thinking about our project outcomes more so than the processes that we are employing. And so I'll be talking mostly about my experiences. So I've been using Power BI for close to 7 years. So I'll be talking about my past experiences and with Power BI design and some of the things that I have struggled with. So where have the friction points been? Where have I come a little bit undone in these design processes? And then some of the techniques that I've used to sort of get a better outcome in report adoption. So as Power BI developers, we tend to all come from different backgrounds. So some of us, will be getting computer science degrees, spending a little time in IT and business intelligence teams, and then finding our way into Power BI that way. And others of us come through business. So that was my background. So I came through strategic management offices, portfolio management offices as a reporting analyst. And as in those roles, I was very much involved in the design and structure of reporting systems, and also as a SME in the design of metrics and frameworks for monitoring and enabling business outcomes and success. So designing and creating KPIs in the business itself. And being a domain expert, the reports that I produced tended to have good feedback. So I was working in business, in a business as usual type role, and my reports were quite well adopted, and I can say happily that some of them are still in use 5 years later with minor modifications, which is pretty cool. But these reports then were designed with strategic frameworks in mind. They were designed to monitor and enable these business outcomes and designed in consultation with the business stakeholders. So a report might be whipped up in 2 to 3 days or 2 to 3 weeks. But then I would sit with the stakeholders individually, watch how they use the reports, and saw where they might be struggling to find information, and I would iterate and tweak and then train to embed these reports into the workplace. So I guess that is probably why I had great adoption. And a report fully embedded might take several months to do. But from there, I decided, I had a great time in business as usual roles, but I wanted to try my hand at consulting because I wanted to get out and learn more about the data, try different data, understand, stretch my wings a little bit. And so when I first moved into consulting, I started on small projects, end to end, again, good feedback, and, projects would be anywhere from a day to whip up to several months. And then from there, I started to work in my way into more senior consulting roles and onto larger projects with project teams with dedicated data engineers, project managers, UXers. Not all my projects as a senior consultant were Power BI development. They were Power BI adjacent, but in some cases, I was still plopped on occasionally as in a development role. And that's when things started to come undone for me. And things started to sort of unfurl, and I was losing a bit of confidence, and I wasn't getting as good outputs with my Power BI reports. And so, what was happening here? So coming onto these larger projects in previous roles, typically the projects will start out, with an account manager talking to, a senior person on the customer side. And they would, the customer would ask, hey, I want a couple of Power BI reports and a data platform. The account manager will then pass that on to a solution architect, and the solution architect will pick that up and then sort of design the architecture. This is a data platform, these are the gateways we need, these are how many Power BI reports, we're going to do it in the service, all that kind of stuff, and sort of design the architecture. That will then be passed on to the data engineer. So then the data engineer will talk with a technical SME on the customer side, ask, what data do you want? What's relevant? What information do you need? And then in this point, the data engineer is thinking, well, I need, so the technical SME is like, I want all the information. And the data engineer is, yes, let's build a model that will scale. So we'll bring in, all the relevant information into a data model, and then that would then get passed on to a UXer. And a UXer will, then talk to an end user for about an hour or two, sort of trying to get, what the kind of experience they want with the report, and produce a couple of design outputs. And these would be personas, wireframes, journey maps, and that would be passed on to a developer. And this is where I was a bit confused. So previously, I've built lots of reports, board reports, Power BI reports, never had to UI, UX a board report before. And I'm like, why am I doing that now? I don't understand what these personas are. And so for me, at this point in time, Power BI was Power Pivot combined with a presentation layer, sort of PowerPoint for data, which is a cool way to interact with your data. I didn't see Power BI as a website or a software product or an app, which I would associate with UI, UX design processes. So it was a little bit of a confusion when being given UX design outputs. And so some of these outputs would sort of look like this. I'd get a beautiful, wonderful wireframe that couldn't be recreated in Power BI. And, it would have actions and buttons and, menus that couldn't be recreated. The colors weren't appropriate for data viz practices. And then, I couldn't see all the information I wanted on a page to interact with it. I had to scroll through and see progressively, chart by chart, the information. And that didn't seem to fit with me. So I was like, okay, what do I do with this? How do I do this? What am I supposed to work on? How am I supposed to work with this in building a report? And I would be given a user persona. And it would be of a manager that stated that they were married, that they were 40, and they were very busy. I'm like, that's wonderful, but how does that help me build my Power BI report? What does married have to do with sales data? I couldn't quite understand it. And I'd read through the personas, and I couldn't find any of the information from these personas that was useful to me as a developer. And then from the data engineers, I would get a rather large spreadsheet of metrics with business logic, and that was very useful. So when I wanted to build measures, it was fantastic to have that business logic in there and building measures. But it was all out of context because I wasn't in these design workshops. And what I couldn't see is that hierarchy that I'm used to. So when building a KPI structure, I couldn't see which measures fed what other measures and the informational groupings. And so it was an awful lot of information, but where was the priority? What did the customer want to see? What was important to them? Like, what was the first thing they wanted? And I was without that context. And similarly, getting this wonderful, really fantastic enterprise model, wonderfully designed, absolutely, but really hard to build a report off of. Because I then had to work out what table fed what table, what measure matched what fact table, and it wasn't in the structure that I needed to be able to build visuals. So trying to put two separate measures on a single date axis was a pain, and it was very, very hard to do because it wasn't designed with that in mind. And similarly, when the fact tables weren't all connected and I'm trying to create a big table, and then I get whirly ants, and this visual won't load. So that was also a bit of a pain point. So typically, you kind of want to design the report first before you design the model. And then again, sort of that absolute crushing feeling when you arrive halfway through a project and you're on the project and you realize that the Power BI report that you're building is purely for exporting to Excel. And then you build your table and the customer asks if they can print or remove the scroll bars. And you realize, the customer really wanted a paginated report or a system, a different tool that had write back. So these were some of my experiences sort of in that developer role. And then occasionally I would land on a project as well in a sort of UX type role where I got to do some of these design things up front for other developers. And so coming onto a project again halfway through, sort of not from the beginning, being asked to design the navigation experience for a Power BI report. I'm like, what do you mean? And it's right there. The navigation's already there. What are you asking me to do? Where's the page menu going to be? How are they going to drill down? Where are the slices and filters going to be? Right there. Power BI already has that. And then, so the person saying, Power BI filters and that page navigation aren't really that fantastic, and I really want to see some hidden slicer panels. And I'm sitting there sort of thinking, well, that doesn't really make an awful lot of sense to me because I've come from flat reporting, not interactive reporting. And then I'm asking, so you want an app within an app within an app, all with different navigation experiences? So I had to sit there and think about that for a while and sort of really kind of wonder what people were actually asking me to do and what they wanted. And it's a funny thing because I find that buttons and bookmarks are really quite slow sometimes. They can be quite terrible maintenance, costly to set up and costly to maintain, and really need good design considerations because a good design is always consistent and sustainable with that as well. And again, sort of wireframing as well wireframing is a very good, useful tool. It's a good communication tool, but it doesn't always work as a deliverable. So being asked to present a wireframe as a deliverable can cause a customer just as much confusion as it does oneself as well. And so thinking about that as well, wireframing sort of intending to pass on to another person in a team. Sometimes things like style guides, templates, and themes can be a little bit more useful for passing on to other developers than a wireframe. These standards can help sort of develop that consistent and visually appealing report, and all these layout patterns can be included in, and navigation tooltips and drill throughs. Button designs can be included in these standards and style guides as well. So wireframing without seeing the data up front before you've got your model can be very difficult, especially when your data can change and they don't know the quality of the data that's going to come through, and you don't know how the metrics are going to look and the data structure. And so wireframing, if not careful, can be time consuming and sort of relatively ineffective as well. So making sure that we're using those wireframes appropriately. So basically wrapping up what was happening, why was I struggling? Again, it's sort of not understanding what UI UX design was, and how it was appropriate for Power BI projects and Power BI reporting projects. Also, my role had definitely changed, so I'd gone from being a domain subject matter expert to a technical subject matter expert, and I had a limited contact with the end users, which is what I was quite used to. And so, in some of these projects, in these particular like waterfall type projects, you tend to lose that customer contact. And there's definitely a lot of handover points where that communication does get lost. So the projects that I was on that were definitely more successful were in projects where the whole team was involved from start to finish, and they were across all the parts of the design and delivery process. And so that communication was there, that context was there, and that definitely produced much better outputs as well. So I'm just making sure I've made all my points. But having said that, there is a place for UX, UI design in Power BI, and there's definitely a place for frameworks. Frameworks, when applied appropriately, definitely help with communication between team members. They help with consistency and knowledge transfer when they are applied, again, appropriately and not too rigidly or literally. So there are a lot of design frameworks about, and they all tend to be derivative of each other. And they all tend to be derivative of human-centered design. And human-centered design is an approach that puts human needs and capabilities and behavior first, and starts with an understanding of psychology and technology. And user experience, derivative of human-centered design, started sort of in the 1990s at Apple with a man called Donald Norman, who was a cognitive scientist, sort of he tacked on to that approach, and many other software companies tacked onto that design approach. And the idea there was to generate innovative products by defining a need or gap or opportunity in the market. So some of the toolings that are used in user research today, like customer journey maps, personas, where you don't have access to or are generalizing the broader public experience, makes sense in that kind of context, because with a persona, you're sort of trying to judge a broad audience that you don't have contact with, and trying to divine a need or a gap in a market. And that's sort of where this user-centered design processes are come from. And one of the conflicts of human-centered design is it's kind of a contradiction when it becomes commercialized. When it's put in a business context, it's no longer people-centered, no longer root-caused or systems thinking. It's commercially driven, and therefore there's cost and time constraints. And, where profits are concerned, humans aren't the focus, they can be harmed. And things like, infinite scrolling is one example of that. Had a good intention, but was actually a bit of a harm for us as people. And other things like e-cigarettes and stuff as well. And there's also problems as well about overgeneralizing the public and your audience in the respect that things like diversity and accessibility can be left to the side and forgotten. So the design doesn't become truly people-centered. So that's a bit of an aside. It's important when sort of thinking about what tools and processes and frameworks that we're using, that we kind of understand the origins of them, why they're built about as well, and that will help decide whether they're appropriate for our projects at hand. And thinking about, are we creating a new product? Are we creating a new service, or are we creating a new software? Or are we meeting a specific need for a specific audience with an existing tool set? Two different approaches. Are we creating or are we crafting? So I was very lucky enough as well in my past experiences that I had a project that did require a bit of user research, which I was very, very excited about. And this project, the customer had a very big question: our reports aren't being used, and why is that? So I definitely had the pleasure of being involved in this bit of user research, and the organization was very large. It had a large base of workers out in the field, and the team that I had engaged with, their role was to democratize the data that they had, make it more accessible for the workers out in the field to be able to utilize for their roles and be more effective in their roles. And so what happened here is they produced a rather large number of reports that weren't being used, and this organization didn't really have the luxury of being able to, go sit at a desk next door and ask some questions of their end users. The end users weren't really that accessible, and so they weren't able to go out and interview these stakeholders for every single report that they built. So the idea was to try and find a way to understand the customer base better for future reporting, increase the adoption and impact, and uplift the internal team as well at the same time in their data visualization skills, and create a consistent experience and design navigation, and create design standards and a customer profile. And so involved in this project and other projects too, there was multiple of these, not just one. I hear a lot of assumptions made about end users sometimes when I go into consulting roles, right? So talking with IT team, BI team, whoever's doing the reporting, they make assumptions about their end users. And so some of the assumptions that I hear, not all of them, these are just a little handful, is they can't find it. They don't know it's there. They need lots of guidance texts. They just don't have time to read the reports. And they have very low data literacy, which is an interesting one. And I've always been intrigued by the fact that people will judge others as having high or low data literacy. And I always wonder how and why they make those assumptions. So in developing a profile of these end users, I sort of took a persona approach, but not quite the age 45, living in London and very, very busy approach. I sort of took a similar approach, but asked a few different little questions. And these were professionals not office-based or corporate professionals. So the questions that I normally ask were a little different than I would ask, say, a finance or a HR team. And different workshops were held for different professionals and leadership teams, and so questions were structured slightly different for the audience. And I also had the luxury of time, which I don't always have the luxury of time. And so I started by getting to know them, asking them how their day-to-day looks like, how often you would use data in your work, how confident are you using data, what you would use data for in your role, and what are your key goals, objectives, and decisions for your role, and how do you think that data can support that. And in a typical project, I don't tend to ask, when I'm delivering for a specific outcome, I don't tend to ask what's your day-to-day. I tend to ask questions around your current reporting process and mapping out the current state process to identify bottlenecks and alleviate pain points and avoid the introduction of more pain points and frustrations into that process. But in this case, with such a broad user base and no specific reports in mind, this was more an investigation into what reports could be useful. So asking, the general day-to-day was a little bit more appropriate in this regard. And then the other questions I asked were about gauging their confidence, their enthusiasm, any resistance that they might have to picking up a data product. And these professionals were quite enthusiastic about using data to enhance their job outcomes, but perhaps lacking a little bit in confidence. And then I wanted to test these assumptions. So there was, the idea here was twofold. So I presented a number of dashboards of, not these particular ones, but similar, of varying degrees of abstraction. So some were very simple in design and some were very complex in design, and they all had different stories to be told. So the idea was also to get a preference for their color palettes, for their designs and layouts and sort of data viz presentation. And also to sort of ask them to draw the key story and highlights from the designs. How easy was it to interpret and where did they have difficulty? So tell us where you find difficulty in interpreting the story and the key highlights from this. And so what I found was that the leadership group remarked that they might be able to understand a complex data visual, but the other team might not. And it turns out that that simply wasn't true. And there was no difference between the two groups in design preferences or data visualization literacy. And they were all as good as each other at discerning the information from the visuals. No matter how bad the design, they were able to grab the insights from those reports. But there were intra-group differences, which I might get to a little bit later. And it's something that I do hear a lot, sometimes around the community, that you have to tailor your report to the audience, and sometimes sort of, I don't want to use the word dumbing down the charts, I can't think of a better word, but using simple charts like bar charts and line graphs, for the audience, because they just don't have the data viz literacy. But I think it's important to be mindful of making assumptions of your audience. So a visual can be complex, and if it's designed right, it can be understood. So if people can read maps, they can read schematics and blueprints or architectural designs and IKEA manuals, chances are that they can read a data visualization if they understand the information behind it. So, for example, shark attacks versus genomic sequencing, right? We're all more able to understand the story behind shark attacks than we would human genomes. Ooh, going back a bit. And as an aside, so of all the different designs that were there, this was their favorite. And this is a favorite across multiple projects that I have done. light mode, high contrast colors, explanatory text and visuals, simple, clean, and not too cluttered. So no buttons, bookmarks, filters, or slices, and that's quite a consistent experience that I have across projects. And then going on to develop a profile is consumption. So asking how they were consumer dashboard relevant to their role, and asking them to design a dashboard on butcher's paper for information relevant to their role, bearing in mind that specific needs were not yet identified. And we found that there were a mix. Some groups produced mostly words and described what they wanted. Some were a mix of words and visual. And we're really focused on making sure that growth, trends, and patterns were identifiable in the charts and the KPIs that they designed. And some were really outstanding. So they designed the entire experience with drill downs, with drill throughs across multiple pages of butcher's papers, with barely having used a Power BI report before. So that was quite an interesting experience to see such a difference in people's ability to sort of describe what they wanted in a dashboard, but they all were very focused on making sure that their key growth and trends were identifiable. And then again, sort of watching them navigate the existing reports and answer a bunch of questions and provide feedback on those dashboards to see where they were struggling and what they liked and what they didn't like with the existing dashboards. And then to find the answer as to why they weren't being used. Well, they were being used, but not being used as much as it was hoped. And, you know, it was fairly obvious in the end that they were quite slow, cluttered, hard to read and interpret. It was hard to find the information, and the information simply was not relevant. Wasn't relevant to their role. It was dated, it was lagging, and didn't help them in their key objectives and the decisions that they need to make in their day-to-day roles. Yeah, so I'm going to pause there for a little break. If anybody wanted to add any comments or questions, yeah. Asking, sorry, I can't repeat the question because it was too long. So how do we find the balance between the functionality and the simplicity of report design? So asking the right questions as well. So there's a lot of questions that you ask in your process, in your business analysis, and which I haven't covered, obviously. But finding the purpose of the report. So a report that's exploratory will tend to have a lot more interactivity, where people are going hunting for their insights. All right, so that's where those buttons, bookmarks, and interactivity does come in useful. But if the report is more explanatory and they want their insights there, then told, and they want actionable reporting, that they tend to prefer less of the interactivity. They don't want to go having to hunt it. So it's sort of trying to work out on that scale as to what's more appropriate for the audience needs. And that's probably a good gauge as to how complex you make your reports. Cool. Give me a minute. Yeah.
Please ask, who is the best person to obtain this information? Is it an outsider or an insider? Actually, who makes the best interviews, finding out what the user's needs are?
I don't think either or. It's whoever's good at inquiring, whoever's the best inquiry skills. Yeah. So I don't think it matters whether they're internal to the business or external to the business.
But what's the personal traits of the interviewer that you have found to be most productive?
What's the personal traits of the interviewer you found to be most productive? I guess somebody that is tech savvy, but has also, you know, good deal of experience within business. I guess, I don't know, it's a tough question. Tough question. Yep.
I have one question. You have a wonderful blog about like data and custom visualization.
Yeah.
The question is, what is the like order before like switching to Deneb, or like there is an option also to try to build like Frankenstein visualization combining the visuals which are already available, or like we decide, okay, I switch to Deneb because the requirements need the client requirements. It's not just available.
So the question is, at what point would you switch from core visuals to custom visuals?
How do you decide, like, okay, like I can deliver the client needs, but for that I need to combine different visuals which are available, or try to build something else of what is there, or I switch to custom visualization, for example, Deneb to achieving.
So that's so repeating the question, when would you go from using core visuals and combining core visuals to going to a custom visual such as Deneb? Is a conversation with the customer sometimes about their appetite for custom visuals and checking in with them whether that's appropriate. And then it's sort of more of a performance-based issue as well. So if combining issues is creating a performance cost, sometimes going to a custom visual will do that. But also then there's the design, right? So if you have a visual that requires a lot of information density, it's multi-dimensional, or you want to improve, say, a heat map by adding bars to make it easier to read, then you can go into the custom visual space. So did that answer the question a bit? Yeah? Cool. Any other questions? No, cool. So moving on from that, I think I might have to speed through the next section. So the key thing that we find across multiple projects, again, is the part of the reason that a report is not being adopted, and there are other reasons a report isn't adopted, is because it wasn't relevant. And so moving on from that, how can we apply techniques to make sure that we are getting relevant information into our dashboards? And so there's ways of doing that, so making sure that we understand the audience goals, that we understand what the report is in context, in business context. So making sure that we've done that business process in mapping as before, making sure we're identifying that we've got the right tool for the right job, and we're not adding pains or adding administrative steps in our process. And then walking through that process with the customer, that current state. Sometimes they'll then find, we've got these audiences, we've got these steps, maybe we need 2 reports or 3 reports, or maybe we don't even need a report at all, which has happened. I have gone through that process and found that they've decided, nah, we don't actually need that report. And then once you go through that process, defining the report, so giving the report an objective and making sure that all the information that is requested from there ties into that objective, because that prevents the report from bloating and having a lot of unnecessary information in it. So if you can't tie the information that's been requested to the objective, then it doesn't go in the report. And so some of the techniques I've seen before is that I have seen, and I've tried as well, sort of this customer journey mapping and user flows. Some people try to use that to find relevant information within their reports. But sometimes this can lead to, so what in this sense we're trying to map all the possible actions that people might take in a report, working out what decision do they need to make, when we're going to go to next, after they've made that decision, where they'll go next. And this can sort of sometimes spin us a little bit. We end up spinning our wheels in analysis paralysis. There's a lot of things that could possibly happen. There's a lot of what ifs, where to's, and things like that. So some of the techniques that I sort of tend to prefer, going back to sort of my board reporting roots, is trying to find things like our KPI trees within an organization, core driver trees, KPI trees, strategic visions, objectives and initiatives, and organizational charts. So getting information in context. So most people in a business will have a particular role, they'll have some strategic KPIs that they need to meet, and then each of these KPIs have flow-through effects as well. And if we can get our hands on these are incredibly useful in helping us design our reporting. If we can't get our hands on them, we can ask questions to sort of start building them in the background. We don't need to build them with the customer, but in the background, we can start to sort of build out a KPI hierarchy or information hierarchy. And this works best for explanatory reports rather than exploratory. Exploratory reports take a different approach as well. So moving through that, we might have an example KPI tree. This one's very, very simple. And there's not really much to it. There's no OKRs or anything. It's just sort of increasing profit, increasing web visitors, increasing new clients. And then it kind of leads to some actions. So how do we increase new clients? Well, we'll go through and we'll list ads. And if we want to increase repeat purchases, we'll look at the efficacy of emails and ad campaigns, which one's more appropriate for whatever demographic it is that we're targeting, and then we'll go away and target and create an action from that. So a good report is insightful, relevant, and actionable. And a KPI tree can help with the design. This one, I threw it together very, very, very quickly. So a little bit more consideration might get a little better outcome on this. But we might start with, an overview page on profit. We could also on this page put the increase in web visitors and purchase size metrics so that we can see how they're affecting each other on the same page. But in this particular example, just an increase of profit. And this is just a wireframe, but we might find something like, Power BI has this wonderful option to explain the increase and decrease on a bar chart or line chart. And, we'll hit that button and it says that we've got a decrease due to sales in Germany and Austria. And then we might go and think about putting some filters on our page for countries. Or we can head down to a lower grain to see country by country view to check out what other things we might be interested in seeing. So here we'll see a view of web visitors by region plus a corresponding basket size and conversion rate. And, this is all hypothetical data. So, we might then find from here that purchase size and conversion rate hasn't gone down, but web visitors have. And then moving through, we can go onto the next page, just a wireframe. And, might put metrics regarding new clients and repeat visitors and repeat purchases. And we'll find that there's a big drop in new clients or a small drop in repeat purchases. And then we can go through again and have maybe a page on campaigns and see the how effective these certain campaigns are for these certain regions, and then sort of pick those and go ahead and try and drive up those repeat purchases and increased web visitors. So that's how a sort of KPI tree can sort of help us design our reports. And I am at time. So any other questions? Yes.
I was just wondering, you talked a little bit about data literacy on the report. Did you find with the report that you created over time with data literacy increasing, did you
So how do users change over time?
Yeah, the data literacy are using the answer to then lead to new requests, or do you feel like once the report is designed with the user in mind, it kind of stays set over time?
So reports should always be tweaked. They should always be iterated upon. And people's preferences will change over time, especially when they've seen data in a particular way, they've had a question. That question's been answered. They no longer need to see that visual anymore because they know the trend, they know the pattern, they know what they're answering. So they might want to tweak the visual, tweak the design to see something else because they have another question. So they'll ask a question, how are my sales tracking? They're great. Okay, well, why are they? Or they're not tracking well. Why are they not tracking well? And you keep going down more and more questions to more and more detail and more complex analyses. So people's data literacy increases. Right, they start off with basic visibility of their data, then they start asking more questions of their data, then they get more sophisticated with their data, and so too do the visuals as well. So you might start at a lower base, and then over time, those reports will always get updated and become more and more complex. Any other questions? No?
Thank you.
Welcome.